Not only was he Hungary's most famous composer since Franz Liszt, but he was a founder of the field of ethnomusicology, and in all he collected nearly 10,000 folk tunes. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Béla Bartók. Bartók was born in March of 1881 in the Hungarian countryside, and before he was even able to talk, he exhibited musical aptitude. His mother gave him piano lessons as a young child, but he was beset by various maladies, including severe eczema. Bartók then began to write his own piano pieces, which he played on recitals that he gave before he was even a teenager. His hometown was on the border of various ethnic groups, and so he was able to absorb different musical languages from different cultures. At age 18, Bartók began study at the Royal Academy of Music in Budapest, and it was there that his musical language really began to refine and develop. He heard modern music for the first time and developed lifelong friendships with those who held similar artistic manifestos to himself. The most important of these early friends was probably Zoltán Kodály, another important figure in the history of Hungarian music in Bartók's time. Bartók wrote his first orchestral pieces after becoming enamored with the tone poems of Richard Strauss, and he also was first exposed to the idea of putting folk songs in serious art music. The latter would serve as a continuous point of musical reference throughout his entire life, and he and Kodály often went to the countryside in order to collect folk tunes and put the cream of the crop into their respective pieces. Bartók was always keen on keeping his piano skills up, a real perk if you're a composer, and his day job was a piano professor in Budapest. All the while, he was studying the asymmetrical rhythms of the folk tunes that he and Kodály collected, and even if Bartók wasn't using a folk tune verbatim in one of his pieces, these unusual rhythmic pulses really drove his pieces. Throughout the course of his life, he would catalog at least 9,600 melodies of Romanian, Slovakian, and, of course, Hungarian origin. 1911 saw Bartók's first and only opera, Duke Bluebeard's Castle, which was a big step forward for his musical language. But it was originally a contest submission, and its failure to secure first prize set Bartók back in his compositional work. The opera is unusual in its relative shortness and its extremely small cast of characters. In fact, there are only 2 singing roles in the entire thing, and as such, when it's performed, is often paired with another small vocal work, usually Schoenberg's monodrama Edvartung, which runs about 30 minutes to Bluebeard's roughly an hour. All told, Bluebeard took 7 years for it to be premiered. The only thing that got him back to his composition desk was World War I, which prevented him from traipsing around the countryside recording folk tunes. His music got much spikier and more dissonant, the classic Bartók sound if there ever was one, and he wrote his first couple of string quartets, as well as beginning work on the ballet The Miraculous Mandarin, whose very adult and very dark subject matter hampered performance for a better part of a decade. Ironically, what got people interested in The Miraculous Mandarin was its eventual banishment under the Nazi regime. Bartók's music can sound jarring, with unsettling chromaticism and pounding polychords derived from these folk rhythms. Yet Bartók always has a high degree of control over exactly what he's doing. In his music for strings, percussion, and celeste, written in 1936, the first movement is a fugue that uses the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio to space out its sections. Because of the aforementioned spikiness, Bartók's music is often mistaken for being atonal, but Bartók always considered it tonal, even if the tonal center is not always audible in whatever the finished product happened to be. Bartók is also credited with the invention of the Bartók pizzicato, where a string player will pull back on a string and then let it snap onto the fingerboard, which gives it really more of a sound than an actual pitch. See, he was always looking for an extra degree of bite to his music, and with techniques like these, it really paid off handsomely. Like many composers of the era, he was fascinated with the ability to generate large amounts of material from very small cells through mathematical operations, such as flipping something around on an axis of symmetry. He wanted to prove to 12-tone enthusiasts that one could use all 12 notes of the chromatic scale and still be tonal. As he was a pianist, Bartók is known for his excellent percussive piano writing, but he was equally at home writing for strings. All told, he would write a cycle of 6 string quartets that would be hailed as the most important since late Beethoven. Bartók took up Beethoven's mantle of continuously searching for new forms, and Bartók's forms are indeed unusual, but they work. Bartók was increasingly wary of the activities of the Hungarian government since the end of World War I, but was especially nervous when the Nazis came to power in Germany. The Hungarian government was not pleased with a renowned composer speaking out against the Nazi regime. They did not want to make waves, and Bartók decided that time had come to leave Europe. When he and his wife arrived in New York in late 1940, they discovered that he wasn't really known in America, at least not as a composer. He was known as a performer or as a musicologist, just that European folk song guy. It didn't really help him that his most famous and widely published piano pieces were his set of mikrokosmos, sets of piano pieces for children. Bartók continued to compose and concertize, but he became increasingly frail and concerned about his health, and this was discovered to be leukemia in 1944. His sixth and final string quartet reflects his utter despondence of being told he had a terminal illness. But when news of this went out to the musical world at large, performers jumped at the chance to commission a final piece from Bartók's pen. With the help of penicillin and blood transfusions, Bartók kept up the pace as best he was able, completing his concerto for orchestra on commission from Serge Koussevitzky. And he called it a concerto for orchestra because he treated each instrumental section, and even instrumental soloists, as if they were the star of a concerto in their passages. As such, it's a virtuosic work for the entire orchestra, showing off for the orchestra as opposed to just showing off for a single soloist. He also wrote his third and final piano concerto, intended for performance by his wife, which eschews all Bartókian expectations in favor of something that's much more neoclassical in its tone. His final piece, however, was his viola concerto, the orchestration of which was left incomplete at his death in 1945, at the age of 64. Bartók's music reflects the changing stylistic trends of the era in which he lived, beginning with the lush late Romantic tradition and then moving towards musical nationalism. He is considered, along with Kodály, to be one of the founders of the field of ethnomusicology, and for good reason, because they were the first to really apply a serious scientific studiousness to the collection and the cataloging of folk tunes.